In a city that worshipped money and power, only one man's name made even the wealthy whisper. He could destroy a life with a phone call and build an empire before sunrise. But beneath his immaculate suits and glass towers lived a man running from the silence that wealth could never buy. And on nights when Lagos slept under thunder and rain, that silence screamed the loudest. The name was Obinna Okafor, a man born from hardship, forged in ambition, and crowned by fear. His empire stretched across industries, his influence across nations. But what the world admired was not his brilliance, it was his danger. Boardrooms trembled when he entered. Competitors avoided his gaze. The press called him a genius, but his employees called him something else. The Shadow King. Obinna's success story had the polish of a legend. A poor mechanic's son who rose to own half the skyline of Lagos. But no one saw the price he had paid, the trust he buried, the kindness he killed, the love he never dared to need. Power, to him, was not ambition. It was protection. Every wall of glass he built around himself was a barrier against the boy who once lost everything. Inside his penthouse, high above the restless city, Obinna lived like a ghost, haunting his own fortune. The marble floors gleamed. The art on the walls spoke of taste, not joy. Every night, he stood before the massive window overlooking Lagos, a kingdom glittering beneath him, untouchable yet unbearably far. His reflection stared back at him, sharp eyes, still face, a soul that had forgotten warmth. Power had given him everything except peace. To outsiders, he was perfection in motion, the billionaire who never smiled, never faltered, never failed. But to Obinna, every victory felt hollow. His days followed an unbroken rhythm of meetings, figures, and silence. Every handshake was calculated, every decision, a war disguised as business. The only sound that echoed in his vast home was the hum of the elevator and the distant thunder beyond the glass. At night, when the rain tapped against the windows, Obinna sometimes remembered where it began. Enugu, the red soil, his father's cracked hands, the laughter that once filled a small house before betrayal stole it. The memory of his father dying poor had shaped his rage into an empire. He had sworn never to be powerless again, but in building his fortress, he had also built his prison. The people around him lived on the edge of his temper. His assistant walked in silence, afraid of speaking a wrong word. His security team followed orders without questions. The city bowed, but no one truly saw him. Obinna moved through life, surrounded by people, yet untouched by connection. Power had turned him into a legend, but legends don't live. They exist. That evening, the storm arrived without warning. Thunder cracked over the skyline, and lightning illuminated the endless stretch of glass towers. The city below scattered for cover, umbrellas blooming in the downpour. Obinna stood by the window, watching the chaos unfold, the sound of rain soft but relentless. For the first time in years, he envied those who ran freely through the streets, faces lifted to the rain, unburdened by power or image. He turned away from the window, the glow of lightning reflecting on his face. His assistant entered quietly, reminding him about a charity gala he was expected to attend, a public show of generosity from a man who no longer believed in humanity. He dismissed the reminder with a wave of his hand, uninterested. Charity was his way of cleansing guilt, not creating goodness. As the thunder rolled, the glass trembled, and for a fleeting second, Obinna imagined his empire cracking like his reflection. He wondered, if all of this disappeared tomorrow, who would mourn him? The thought unsettled him, but he buried it like all the others. Feelings, after all, were weaknesses he could not afford. He walked through the dimly lit hall of his penthouse, marble floors, towering portraits, perfect symmetry. Everything was in place, yet nothing felt alive. Somewhere between success and loneliness, he had lost the version of himself that could still feel wonder. But destiny, silent and patient, had already begun to stir. Outside, the rain fell heavier, blurring the skyline into a haze of gold and gray. Cars honked far below, thunder grumbled above, and somewhere beyond the guarded gates of his empire, a girl with torn sandals, soaked clothes, and the brightest smile was about to walk toward the building that everyone feared to enter. She had no idea that her courage would ignite a storm greater than the one above the city. And when Obinna's cold eyes met hers for the first time, a poor girl standing in the rain, unafraid and unbroken, the man the city feared would finally meet, the one person who could melt the steel in his soul. Nothing after that night would ever be the same again. They said the billionaire had no heart, that nothing human could touch him anymore. But that was before the rain, before a barefoot girl with eyes full of courage and a smile brighter than lightning walked into his world, without fear. In a city where everyone bowed to power, she was the first soul who didn't. And that's why he could never forget her. The storm swept through Lagos like a wild memory, tearing umbrellas, drenching rooftops, and soaking every street until the city shimmered under silver rain. Cars honked impatiently. Vendors rushed to cover their goods, but one girl stayed behind, her small stand of roasted corn still steaming beside the iron gates of Okafor Holdings. Chiamaka had learned long ago that the rain was not her enemy. Hunger was. She was young, maybe 21, her feet bare and cracked from long days on hot pavement. The sleeves of her faded yellow dress clung to her arms as she turned each cob of corn over the fire, the smoke mingling with the rain like a stubborn prayer. Every droplet that hit her skin felt like a challenge, but her laughter, soft, melodic, full of defiance, rose above the noise. She had lost much in life, her parents to sickness, her dreams to poverty, her youth to survival, but not her spirit, never her smile. The massive gates of Okafor Holdings loomed behind her, gold letters glinting through the storm. She had never been inside, but she knew who ruled within. Obinna Okafor, the man the whole city feared. To her, his name was just another rumor of power, a man too rich to see the world below him, a man who probably didn't know what rain felt like. She sometimes wondered what kind of life one must live to make people tremble at their shadow. When the rain thickened to a silver curtain, Chiamaka lifted her tray, ready to find shelter. The wind howled, pulling her scarf loose as she dashed beneath the marble awning of the skyscraper. The guards at the door stiffened immediately, their voices sharp. "Hey, you can't stay here." She turned to them, calm but firm, the rain still dripping from her hair. "I'm not asking to go inside," she said quietly. "I just need to wait for the sky to calm." One of the guards stepped forward, trying to sound authoritative. "Madam, you don't understand. This place—" "I understand perfectly," she interrupted softly, her eyes locking with his. "But rain doesn't choose where to fall. It falls on everyone, rich or poor." The guard hesitated, glancing toward the glass doors behind him, afraid of being caught arguing with a vendor. Chiamaka, however, simply set her tray down and looked toward the city. The downpour reflected in her eyes, not as struggle, but as resilience. She wasn't just sheltering from the rain. She was daring the world to move her. Inside, the elevator descended from the top floor. The polished silver doors slid open with a soft chime, and out stepped a man whose very stillness commanded the air, Obinna Okafor. His presence was immediate, powerful, the kind that made even confident men shrink without realizing why. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable, his silence heavier than thunder. The guards straightened instantly. "Sir," one began, but stopped when Obinna raised his hand. His gaze had already found her. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The storm softened outside, the sounds of Lagos fading into a distant hum. Chiamaka stood barefoot against the marble, her soaked dress clinging to her frame, her breath visible in the cold air. And yet, Her eyes, warm, unwavering, alive, met his without flinching. Obinna was used to fear, to admiration, to people lowering their gaze. But this girl looked at him like he was just a man. No title, no power, just another soul standing between her and the rain. That gaze, simple, fearless, human, disarmed him in a way no rival ever had. Something inside him shifted, a crack in the armor he had spent years perfecting. Her smile came then, soft, sudden, and astonishingly kind. It wasn't the smile of someone who wanted something. It was the smile of someone who understood struggle, and yet chose to be gentle anyway. For a man who measured life in contracts and silence, that smile was a language he didn't know how to answer. The guards glanced nervously, waiting for him to speak, to restore order, to tell her to leave. But he didn't. He stood there, watching her as if time had forgotten its purpose. His voice, when it finally came, was low, but clear. Let her be. The guards exchanged startled looks. Obinna never said things like that. He turned and walked toward his car, but his eyes lingered for one last second on the girl who stood unshaken before his empire. Something about her, the rain on her skin, the calm in her stance, the life in her eyes, followed him long after he left the building. That night, as his car cut through the wet streets, Obinna sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the rain-speckled window. Behind the blur of city lights, he saw her face again, bright, unafraid, impossibly alive. And for the first time in years, he realized how empty his world had become without laughter. He told himself it was nothing, a passing moment, a forgettable face. But as the rain kept falling and her smile refused to fade from his mind, Obinna knew something had changed. He didn't yet understand it, but destiny had already chosen her to be the one thing his fortune could never buy: peace. Some encounters are written not by chance, but by destiny, disguised as routine. He didn't believe in fate. Not until the morning he found her again, her laughter weaving through the chaos of Lagos like sunlight after a storm. The world called him untouchable, but that day, a poor girl's song reached the one place he thought was beyond redemption: his heart. The rain had washed the city clean, leaving the streets glistening under the soft light of dawn. Workers hurried toward buses, vendors called out for customers, and Lagos began its noisy rhythm once again. Yet for Obinna Okafor, the morning felt strangely still. He stood at the window of his top-floor office, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, his reflection fractured across the glass. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the barefoot girl in the rain, unbothered by fear, unbroken by circumstance. He told himself it didn't matter, but something restless stirred inside him, a curiosity that refused to quiet. Against logic, against pride, he descended from his office, something he almost never did. The elevator doors opened, and the polished marble lobby greeted him with silence. Then, through the glass, he saw her again. Chiamaka was at her usual spot outside the gates, her small stand neatly arranged with roasted peanuts and corn. She was humming softly, a tune without words, her rhythm steady, her eyes calm. The world moved around her, cars rushing by, people shouting. But she existed like a pause in the city's noise, a moment of peace no one noticed except him. Obinna watched for a moment, unnoticed, until his assistant approached nervously. "Sir, your meeting—" "Cancel it," he said simply. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of finality. The assistant froze. Obinna stepped forward, his steps slow, measured. When Chiamaka finally looked up, she blinked in surprise, her smile returning almost immediately. "Good morning, sir," she greeted cheerfully, unaware of the silent storm she was causing among the onlookers. "The rain spared us today." He studied her for a long moment before saying quietly, "Come upstairs." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. The guards exchanged startled glances. The assistant nearly dropped his tablet. No one was invited upstairs, not journalists, not politicians, not even his own staff, unless summoned. But Chiamaka didn't sense the weight of it. She hesitated, then nodded gently. "All right," she said simply, lifting her tray and following him toward the glass doors. Inside, the contrast was overwhelming. The elevator hummed softly as it carried them upward, from the street's noise into a world of silence and glass. Chiamaka looked around in quiet awe. The walls gleamed. The air smelled of polished wood and cold air conditioning. Yet what struck her most was not the wealth. It was the emptiness. Every inch of space was perfect, but lifeless. When the elevator stopped, Obinna led her into his office, a vast room overlooking the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows catching the morning light. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Chiamaka obeyed politely, her small hands folded in her lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Obinna wasn't used to company that didn't want something from him. And Chiamaka wasn't used to sitting before someone who could command the world, but didn't seem to know how to speak from the heart. "You work here every day?" he finally asked, his tone softer than he intended. "Yes, sir," she replied. "The workers buy peanuts during their break. It's enough to eat sometimes." Her smile was faint, not bitter, just honest. He nodded, unsure why her words unsettled him. She didn't plead, didn't flatter, didn't seem afraid. When she laughed at some small joke about the rain dripping from her scarf, even the sound seemed to fill the room. A melody in a place built for silence. Obinna found himself watching her more than listening. Her laughter wasn't forced. It was freedom. It made him realize how long it had been since he had heard something that real. She rose after a few minutes, gathering her things. "Thank you," she said with quiet sincerity, "for letting me wait out the rain yesterday. And for this." He nodded again, but before she reached the door, her voice stopped. Him. "You live in a palace," she said softly, her hand on the handle. "But you look lonelier than me." The words pierced through him with quiet precision. For a man used to power, truth had never felt so heavy. She left before he could reply, her laughter echoing faintly down the hallway, like a promise he didn't understand. That night, as the city lights flickered below his penthouse, Obinna sat by the window again. Her words played on a loop in his mind. "You look lonelier than me." He had been called ruthless, powerful, brilliant, but never lonely. For the first time, he realized she was right, and that realization was the beginning of everything he could no longer control. Sometimes, even the richest sleep in the company of ghosts. No matter how high the walls or how polished the glass, the past always finds a way back in. And that night, when thunder whispered against the windows of his lonely mansion, Obinna Okafor met the one man whose shadow still ruled him. His father. The rain had eased into silence, leaving the night heavy and still. On the upper floor of his penthouse, Obinna sat alone in his bedroom. The city stretched below him like a galaxy of trembling lights. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Flawless, unfeeling. A man who had conquered everything except himself. The echo of Chiamaka's words still lingered in his head. "You live in a palace, but you look lonelier than me." He closed his eyes, trying to shut her voice out, but it was no use. The truth had been planted like a seed, and it was already breaking through the cracks of his certainty. He poured himself a drink, the liquid catching the soft light, amber and haunting. But as he lifted the glass to his lips, something inside him twisted. A memory, sharp and uninvited. He saw his father's hands, rough, tired, covered in grease from the small mechanic shop where he had spent his life fixing other people's cars, but never his own. He remembered the nights when the generator failed, when they ate in darkness, when laughter tried to fill the void of hunger. His father had been proud, too proud to beg, too kind to fight. and Obinna had watched as that pride destroyed him. Betrayal had come from a friend, a man his father trusted with everything. One signature, one deceitful deal, and the shop was gone. His father's name was ruined. His health broke soon after. Obinna was 16 the night he found his father sitting outside the shuttered workshop, the tools scattered like bones, his eyes hollow. "Don't ever let anyone make you small, Obinna," he had said, voice cracking beneath the weight of loss. "If you must fight the world, fight until it bows." Those words became his creed. That night turned him into something unbreakable, or so he thought. Now, years later, as the billionaire stared through the glass, the ghost of that man sat beside him again, not to bless his success, but to question it. "Is this what you became for me?" the silence seemed to ask. Obinna turned away, but the reflection followed. His father's face, his own face, both haunted, both tired. He had spent a lifetime avenging poverty, turning pain into empire. Every deal signed, every rival defeated. All of it had been his rebellion against helplessness. But Chiamaka's voice, that simple truth wrapped in gentleness, had undone something deep. "You look lonelier than me." It wasn't an insult. It was a revelation. He had built castles of steel to keep the world out, not realizing he'd trapped himself inside. The night pressed closer, the city's glow flickering against the windows like candlelight on water. He drifted into uneasy sleep, but his mind didn't rest. In his dreams, he was back in Enugu, standing in front of his father's workshop. The doors were open, the air thick with the smell of oil and rain. He walked inside, but instead of tools, he found mirrors. Countless mirrors, each reflecting a different version of himself. The boy who cried beside his father's coffin. The young man who swore never to be poor again. The adult who learned to silence his heart. From one of the mirrors, a voice echoed, his father's, deep and weary. "You've built a world, my son. But tell me, is it a world that knows peace?" Obinna turned toward the sound, but all he saw was himself, older, richer, colder. The reflection smiled sadly. Even kings can be slaves to ghosts. He woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as if he had run miles. The clock beside his bed ticked softly, the only sound in the vast silence of the room. The glass walls shimmered with the pale blue of dawn. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he heard it again, not from the dream, not from memory, but from within. Her voice, soft and unwavering. "You look lonelier than me." He sat up, his breath unsteady, the sheet clinging to his skin. The glass before him now reflected not power, not victory, but a man stripped bare by truth. For the first time, he realized that ghosts don't live in the dark. They live behind the glass, inside the silence we choose not to break. As the sun rose over Lagos, painting gold across the skyline, Obinna stared at his reflection one last time and whispered to the emptiness. Maybe she was right. But even he didn't realize yet that one girl's smile had awakened not just guilt, but the part of his soul his father once loved most. The battle with his ghosts had only just begun. In a city where even honesty had a price, she carried her pride like a crown. She had no riches, no power, no name that echoed through the streets, yet she stood taller than the man who ruled them all. And when the billionaire tried to buy her gratitude, she taught him a lesson he'd never heard before. Dignity cannot be purchased. Days passed, but Chiamaka's smile continued to haunt Obinna's thoughts, like a melody he couldn't silence. Time wasn't infatuation. It was disruption. Her presence had left a quiet mark on his carefully ordered world. For years, people had approached him with masks, seeking favors, money, or validation. But she had looked at him and seen not a king, but a man. That truth, spoken without words, unsettled him in ways his enemies never could. He told himself he was simply helping, that sending her food, gifts, and money was a gesture of goodwill, not guilt. The next morning, his driver delivered a carefully packed basket of fruits and bread to her small stand near the gates. Hours later, when he returned to his office, he found the basket waiting at his door, untouched, the contents perfectly arranged, a single note resting on top. "I sell with my hands, not with my pity." The words hit him harder than he expected. He stared at the note for a long time, his jaw tightening. Pride, he thought. Foolish, unnecessary pride. Yet beneath his frustration was something else. Respect. No one had ever refused him before. No one had dared. And now a poor vendor had not only rejected his gifts, but had done so with grace. In the days that followed, he tried again, quietly, indirectly. He had her stand repaired after it was damaged by the rain, sent her new shoes through a vendor he trusted, even arranged for one of his staff to offer her a better job in a company kitchen. Each time, she found out. Each time, she returned the offer. And each time, she did it without anger, only calm understanding, as if speaking to a child who hadn't yet learned how to listen. "You think kindness means control," she told him one afternoon when their paths crossed again by the gate. Her tone wasn't sharp. It was soft, steady. "But real kindness lets others stand, not kneel." Her words left him momentarily speechless. He, who had silenced boardrooms and crushed rivals, could not find a single response to a girl selling corn in the sun. He watched her hands move swiftly, wrapping roasted ears in old newspaper, her rhythm precise and unhurried. There was a quiet dignity in her labor, the same dignity he had traded long ago for comfort and control. That evening, as he sat in his car, he found himself replaying her voice. Every syllable carried something he couldn't name. Honesty, maybe, or freedom. He wanted to help her, to make her life easier, yet something told him that wasn't what she wanted. She didn't need saving. She needed to be seen. A week later, word reached him that Chiamaka's mother had fallen ill. The news came from one of his staff who bought food from her daily. Obinna acted immediately, not out of pity, but out of instinct. He called his private physician, arranged medication, and had it delivered to her home without revealing his name. It was the only way he knew how to care, from a distance, through control. But the next morning, she appeared outside his building again, holding the medicine bag in her hands. She wasn't angry. Her expression was calm, almost tender. But her eyes carried the sadness of someone who had just confirmed what she had always suspected. "You still don't know how to love without control," she said quietly. "You give, but you never let people give back. That's not love, sir. That's loneliness trying to disguise itself." Her words lingered in the air, soft but cutting. She set the medicine on the marble steps and walked away, her figure framed against the city's morning light. The guards watched her leave, unsure whether to feel pity or admiration. Obinna stood by his office window, frozen in place, her voice replaying in his mind like an echo refusing to fade. That night, his penthouse felt emptier than ever. The walls seemed to listen, the glass reflecting not the skyline, but the face of a man stripped of excuses. He thought of her defiance, her honesty, her pride. She wasn't part of his world. She was the mirror he had avoided all his life. And as the city lights flickered beneath him, Obinna finally understood why she unsettled him so deeply. She was everything he had spent his entire life trying not to be, unafraid of struggle, unowned by wealth, and free. There are moments when destiny disguises itself as kindness, when a gift meant to heal ends up unraveling every wall a heart has built. That was the kind of gift Obinna gave her. It was not wrapped in ribbon or wealth, but in intention, a dangerous kind, the kind that makes two worlds collide. And from that moment, neither his empire nor her innocence would ever remain the same. The morning after their last encounter, The city was alive with its usual rhythm: car horns, street vendors, distant echoes of ambition. Yet inside Obinna's office, silence ruled. He had spent half the night replaying her words, the calm defiance in her voice when she said, "You still don't know how to love without control." Those words were not accusations, they were truth. And truth, he realized, was far more dangerous than hate. He decided to do something different, something that wasn't about power, or guilt, or pride. Through his foundation, he offered her a scholarship. It wasn't a bribe, it was a bridge. Or perhaps that's what he wanted to believe. The formality of the gesture gave him distance, yet the choice of who received it made it deeply personal. He told himself it was a second chance, not just for her, but for the man he could still become. When Chiamaka received the news, she came to him personally, her expression calm but questioning. "Why me?" she asked. "There are hundreds of others who need this more." "Because you'll use it," he replied simply. "You don't waste what's given, even when you don't want it." For a long time, she said nothing. Her gaze lingered on his face, reading what words didn't reveal. Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that neither mocked nor forgave. "You think, learning my way into your world will make me one of you," she said. "But I'll learn from it, not belong to it." He almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because her certainty disarmed him. "Then learn," he said, "and show me what I've forgotten." That night, under the faint hum of Lagos lights, she filled out the scholarship form. Her mother's health had begun to fail, and though pride burned in her, love burned brighter. She told herself she wasn't accepting his help. She was accepting her mother's chance to live in peace. But deep down, a small part of her wondered what made him care. Weeks passed. She attended classes at the university the foundation supported. She studied late into the night, her notebooks filled with dreams written in steady, determined script. Every visit Obinna made to the campus unsettled her. He didn't speak much. He simply stood at the back of the room, listening. His presence was like thunder before rain, silent, charged, impossible to ignore. Students whispered about them. Some said he saw her as a daughter, others, a mystery. She ignored them all. She had learned long ago that gossip fades faster than integrity. Still, every time she caught his eyes during lectures, something in her chest shifted. Not affection, not yet, but an awareness of two lives quietly entangled by fate's strange design. For Obinna, those visits became his only moments of peace. Watching her debate ideas with professors, seeing her help other students without asking for recognition, it reminded him of something money couldn't buy: purpose. The empire he had built now felt hollow beside her simple hunger to learn. Then came the moment that changed everything. A charity event was held on the campus, a celebration of the foundation's success. Obinna attended, his presence turning heads as always. But this time, the cameras caught more than his power. One photograph, a single frame, captured him laughing beside her. Her head tilted back, sunlight on her face, his expression softer than anyone had ever seen. It was innocent, unguarded, human. By morning, that photograph was everywhere. The billionaire and the street girl. Power meets poverty, or something more. Blogs, tabloids, and social media devoured the image. His board demanded answers. Politicians whispered. Investors panicked. For a man whose name had always inspired fear, the world had finally found his weakness. A smile that looked too real to explain away. Inside his office, the photo lay on his desk, printed in a newspaper headline. He stared at it for hours, unmoving. Not because of the scandal, but because, for the first time, he saw what everyone else saw. Not power, not charity, but tenderness. Something that had no place in the empire he ruled. That night, as the city's lights flickered like judgment from 1,000 windows, Obinna realized this was no longer about generosity or redemption. The world had found the one truth he had tried to bury, that the poorest girl in the city had given the richest man something he'd never owned: vulnerability. And the storm that followed would test whether either of them could survive it. The world that worships you will be the first to throw stones when you stumble. For years, Obinna Okafor had ruled Lagos like a quiet storm, feared, admired, untouchable. But all it took was one photograph, one smile, one girl with nothing but truth in her eyes to turn the city he built into a courtroom and himself into its accused. The morning headlines were merciless. "Billionaire and street vendor. Secret affair," screamed every tabloid. The image of Chiamaka's laughter beside his softened face splashed across screens and billboards. The internet spun its tales faster than reason could catch up. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Some mocked him, others pitied her, but most delighted in the chaos. It wasn't just gossip, it was spectacle. Lagos had found its newest sin to consume. Inside the glass towers of his empire, panic rippled like fire through dry grass. Investors called in fear, board members whispered of brand damage. His assistants avoided his gaze. His lawyers rehearsed statements that reeked of polished dishonor. The same men who once toasted his ruthlessness now spoke of moral compromise. Power, he realized, had never truly been loyalty, only convenience wearing a suit. But what hurt more wasn't their betrayal. It was what the storm had done to her. Chiamaka, whose smile once defied the rain, now became a name on everyone's lips, twisted, mocked, dirtied. Reporters camped outside her small house, neighbors stopped buying from her stall, and strangers spat her name like poison. The city that ignored her poverty now punished her for being noticed. Obinna watched from his office, jaw clenched, fury and guilt rising like smoke inside him. For years, he had silenced opposition with strategy, controlling every narrative. But this was different. You can't negotiate with gossip. You can't silence shame. By noon, he called for a press conference. His advisors begged him not to. They warned that showing emotion would make him look weak. But Obinna had crossed too many lines to pretend anymore. When he stepped onto the stage, dozens of microphones pointed toward him like daggers. Cameras flashed, questions shouted. He stood still for a long moment before speaking. "I have nothing to hide," he began, his voice calm but sharp, the kind that demanded silence. "The young woman in those photos is not my scandal. She is my reminder that humanity still exists in a world that worships money and mocks kindness. If protecting her costs me everything I own, then so be it. Some things are worth the ruin." Gasps rippled through the room. The journalists had come for weakness, but found strength. Yet strength, in a world addicted to outrage, was not enough. The next day, stock prices fell. Clients pulled out. His board held an emergency meeting without inviting him. For the first time in years, the man who owned the city stood at risk of losing it all, and he didn't care. What kept him awake that night wasn't the fall of his empire, but the thought of her, alone, hunted, hurt because of him. He sent people to find her, but no one could. Her phone was disconnected, her small house empty, her market stall overturned by those who once envied her spirit. The world that had adored her courage now treated her as a stain on the reputation of a man who never asked to be loved. He sat by his window until dawn, the same window where he had once stared at his reflection and seen nothing but victory. Now he saw a man stripped bare, not a ruler, not a savior, just a man who had finally discovered what it meant to lose something real. At sunrise, one of his staff entered quietly, carrying an envelope. "Sir," the young woman said softly, "someone left this at the gate." Obinna reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, no signature, only the faint scent of rain and roasted corn. her scent. He unfolded it slowly, reading the words that silenced the entire room around him. "I won't be your story's reason to fall." The handwriting was careful, deliberate, every stroke steady, every letter resolute. She hadn't left out of fear, but out of love. She had walked away to protect the only thing he still had left, his redemption. Obinna pressed the letter to his chest, his breath unsteady as the city outside came alive with its usual indifference. He had once believed he could control every outcome, every story, every destiny. But now, as the morning light poured into his empty office, he understood the cruelest truth of all. The girl who had nothing had given him everything, and in return, he had given her the one thing she never asked for: pain. There comes a moment when silence grows louder than applause, when the walls that once protected you begin to whisper your mistakes back to you. For Obinna, the empire he built had become a tomb lined with gold. Every chandelier, every polished marble floor, every painting that once proclaimed victory, now reflected only absence. And in that vast emptiness, he finally understood the curse of having everything except the one thing that mattered. He had searched for her everywhere. He sent cars through the narrow streets of Lagos, questioned vendors in markets, bribed nurses at clinics, even visited remote villages hoping someone would whisper her name. But Chiamaka had disappeared, as though the city itself had swallowed her. For a man accustomed to control, her absence felt like punishment, a wound that refused to heal. Each morning, he returned to his mansion, greeted by silence that settled like dust on his soul. The same house that had hosted powerful men and glittering parties now echoed only with the hollow rhythm of his footsteps. The kitchen remained untouched, the dining table set but unused. His guards lowered their eyes when he passed, as if afraid to meet the gaze of a man unraveling. Business became his only refuge, though even that no longer obeyed him. Meetings blurred together, numbers, contracts, and empty signatures. His partners spoke in cautious tones, as though addressing a wounded lion. He nodded at their plans, but heard none of them. In the boardroom, he was present in body, absent in spirit. The empire he had built with iron discipline was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of his distraction. At night, he sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him, the city lights flickering through the tall windows. Every sound seemed amplified: the ticking clock, the wind brushing against the glass, the faint hum of the distant highway. They all conspired to remind him of what he had lost. He would close his eyes and see her smile, hear her voice, remember her defiance when she said, "You still don't know how to love without control." Those words were now prophecy. He tried to write to her, countless times. Each letter began with apology and ended in silence. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound like another attempt to possess what he should have cherished freely? In her, he had found something the city couldn't corrupt, and in losing her, he had lost his last connection to humanity. Weeks passed. His staff grew uneasy. Rumors spread through the city that Obinna Okafor had gone mad, that the man who once commanded power now roamed his mansion at night, muttering her name into the dark. Some said he had driven her away, others that she had cursed him. He didn't correct them, let them think what they wanted. In truth, the curse had always been his own pride. The mansion, once alive with motion, became a museum of regret. Her laughter haunted the corridors like a melody half-remembered. The piano in the parlor, untouched for years, seemed to wait for her hands. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the open windows, it sounded like faint music, a cruel trick that made him rise suddenly, heart racing, only to find emptiness staring back. He began to sleep less, eat less. The bodyguards whispered that he barely spoke anymore. The cooks prepared meals that returned untouched. His personal assistant resigned quietly, unable to bear the ghostly stillness of a man who once ruled Lagos like a god. And then, one night, when the rain began to fall softly against the city, the same kind of rain that had brought her to his building months ago, his phone buzzed on the table. The screen glowed with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. There was no greeting, no introduction, just a woman's calm voice, steady and professional. "Mr. Okafor?" "Yes," he said, his tone wary. "I'm calling from St. Benedict's Hospital," she continued. "A patient came in under an unregistered name, but before losing consciousness, she asked us to send this message to you." His breath caught. What message? There was a pause, the faint sound of paper being unfolded. Then the voice returned, softer this time, almost hesitant. "She said to tell you, she's dying." The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the marble floor. For a moment the world went soundless. The hum of the air conditioner, the patter of rain, the city beyond the glass, all of it vanished beneath the weight of those two words. He stood there, motionless, staring at the phone's screen as if it could undo what he had just heard. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the vast emptiness around him. The empire, the wealth, the hollow victories. For years he had believed nothing could shake him. Yet now, those two words had broken what power never could. As thunder rolled across the city, Obinna whispered her name into the silence, his voice trembling for the first time in his life. And before the rain could stop, he was already gone, driving into the night, toward the only truth he had ever run from. Sometimes, life waits until the edge of death to remind you what it truly means to live. For a man who had conquered everything and feared nothing, Obinna Okafor never imagined the moment that would bring him to his knees would come in a quiet hospital room. Not a boardroom, not a battlefield, but beside the frail hand of the only person who had ever seen through his armor. That night, love met mortality, and pride finally learned how to kneel. The tires screeched as his car came to a stop outside St. Benedict's Hospital. Rain streaked across the windshield, like tears that refused to wait for his own. He ran through the glass doors, soaked, breathless, driven by something rawer than desperation. Fear. The man who once moved the city with commands now found himself stumbling through hallways, asking questions no money could answer. "Where is she? The patient who called for me." "Where?" The nurse hesitated, recognizing the face that graced magazine covers and business channels. Her voice softened. "Room 204, she said. "But sir, she's very weak." He didn't wait. He pushed past, ignoring the sterile smell of antiseptic, the echo of hurried footsteps, the whispers that followed him. He burst through the door and froze. There she was, Chiamaka, pale against white sheets, an IV line tracing down her arm, her breath shallow but steady. Her hair, once wild with wind and laughter, now framed her face like a shadow of what once was. And yet, even in that fragility, her smile was soft, not out of joy, but of peace, as though she had made her peace long before he arrived. "Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice low, unsteady, breaking in ways it never had. His hand trembled as he reached for hers, as though afraid she might vanish again. She turned her head, slightly, her eyes meeting his with the same calm defiance he remembered, the kind that once disarmed his power without a word. "Because you were never mine," she whispered. "You belong to power, and power doesn't know how to stay." He shook his head, his throat tightening. "I belong here," he said. "Now. With you." Her lips curved faintly, not in disbelief, but in the quiet acceptance of someone who had already lived through too much to hope for, forever. "No, Obinna. You belong to the world, to the noise, to the fight, to everything that keeps you from silence. I only ever wanted you to see what silence feels like." He fell silent, her words piercing deeper than any wound he had known. The machines around her hummed softly, the steady rhythm of her heart echoing through the room. He wanted to offer her everything: doctors, medicine, the best care money could buy. But he could see it in her eyes. This wasn't about what could be fixed. This was about what had already been spent. He pulled a chair closer, sitting beside her, his hand still holding hers. For the first time in his life, Obinna Okafor had no speech, no plan, no solution. Only presence. The clock ticked quietly, each second feeling heavier than the last. "Do you remember the rain that night?" she asked suddenly, her voice thin as breath. "When I stood by your building?" He nodded, tears gathering where pride once stood. "I remember everything. You looked at me like I was something strange," she said softly. "But I think you were the one who was lost that night. You just didn't know it yet." He tried to smile, but it broke halfway. "And you found me," he whispered. "No," she murmured, her eyes fluttering. "I just showed you where to look." Her hand grew colder beneath his. Panic surged through him, but she squeezed weakly, anchoring him back to calm. He leaned closer, his voice trembling. "You can't leave me. Not now. Not after all this." She smiled faintly, her eyes drifting toward the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain outside, reflections dancing across her face like stars on water. "You'll be fine," she said. "Maybe not tonight, but someday. You'll wake up and remember how to breathe again." He shook his head, tears falling freely now. The heart monitor beside her began to slow, its rhythm uneven, uncertain. He gripped her hand tighter, his other hand pressed to his forehead. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please don't do this." Her lips parted, her final words barely audible. "You always wanted to control everything, Obinna. But some things you can only love." And then the monitor let out a sound, a drawn-out tone that seemed to stretch across eternity. He pressed his forehead to her hand, his body trembling with a pain he had never known. The doctors rushed in, the room flooded with movement and noise, but he didn't hear them. Through the blur of his tears, he looked at the window, the rain outside still falling gently, and whispered a prayer to a God he had never believed in. Not for power, not for mercy, just for one more heartbeat. There comes a moment when even the strongest man realizes that power cannot buy back breath, nor silence the sound of a dying heart. That night, Obinna Okafor, the man Lagos once feared to even approach, sat on the cold floor of a hospital room, his head bowed, his pride shattered. For the first time in his life, he was not a billionaire, not a ruler, not a legend. He was simply a man, terrified of losing the only soul who had ever seen him. The days that followed were endless. He refused to leave her side. The hospital staff whispered as he sat motionless beside Chiamaka's bed, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He, who once commanded boardrooms with a single glance, now looked small beneath the harsh white light. Nurses came and went, doctors murmured updates, but he remained there, silent, steadfast, waiting for a miracle he had never before believed in. Outside the hospital gates, the world watched with morbid fascination. Reporters swarmed like vultures, broadcasting his downfall. "The billionaire who finally fell," one headline read. Others turned it into a spectacle. "From power to pain, Obinna Okafor's mysterious love story." The same city that once bowed before him now whispered about his tears, his devotion, his fall from grace. But for once, he didn't care. The empire could crumble, the markets could crash. Nothing mattered more than the faint, fragile rhythm of her breathing. He used his wealth not to rebuild his image, but to fight for her life. He called specialists from London, surgeons from Johannesburg, and doctors from Abuja. He sold one of his companies quietly, the one that bore his father's initials, to pay for her treatment. Not for attention, not for redemption, but because it was the only power he still understood, the power to give. The media would never know. It wasn't charity. It was a confession. When he wasn't in the room, he wandered the hospital corridors like a ghost. He visited the chapel at midnight, standing in the dim candlelight, unsure how to pray. His reflection in the glass pane looked unrecognizable, the sharp edges dulled, the arrogance gone. "If she lives," he whispered into the silence, "I'll give everything back. Everything." His voice cracked, the words trembling as if afraid to exist. Just let her live. Days turned into weeks. Slowly her condition began to shift, uncertain, but hopeful. The doctors said the infection was fading. Her heart was stronger. Hope became a fragile flame, flickering but alive. One evening, as the golden light of sunset spilled into the room, he sat by her bed, his hand resting near hers. The monitors beeped softly, their steady rhythm filling the silence between them. Then, a faint sound, her voice, thin and soft, breaking through the stillness. "Obinna?" His head shot up, disbelief and relief crashing together in his chest. "Chiamaka," he whispered, his hand tightening around hers. "I'm here. I never left." Her eyelids fluttered, revealing tired but lucid eyes. A weak smile crossed her lips. "You look different," she murmured. He gave a broken laugh, his voice rough. "I'm not the same man." She blinked slowly, her breathing shallow but steady. "Now you know," she said, her words carrying the weight of truth. "What love costs." He lowered his head, tears falling freely for the first time in decades. The man who once swore never to cry had been undone by kindness. Hers, not his. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was revelation. She had taught him what power could never teach, that love is not control, but surrender. He took her hand gently, afraid to break the fragile miracle before him. "You once said I belonged to power," he whispered. "You were right. But if you live, Chiamaka, I'll make your kindness my empire." She smiled faintly, eyes half closing again, her breath soft as the fading sunset. "Then start by forgiving yourself," she murmured. He nodded, his tears soaking the back of her hand, the city outside unaware that its most powerful man had finally fallen, and in that fall, found his humanity. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the city slept, Obinna remained at her side, her fragile pulse steady beneath his touch. The empire he once ruled had fallen silent, but in its ruins, a new one began, one built not on fear or wealth, but on the quiet, trembling strength of love. And as he whispered his promise into the dark, her fingers twitched weakly in his palm, the smallest sign of life, and the beginning of his redemption. When the storms of life strip a man of everything he hides behind, what remains is either ruin or rebirth. For Obinna Okafor, the billionaire once feared by a city, ruin had come first. But from its ashes rose something gentler, something rare. The empire of fear had fallen. In its place, a kingdom of mercy began to bloom. It didn't start with power or profit. It started with a smile that had once stood barefoot in the rain. Months had passed since the night he almost lost her. The world that once mocked his downfall now whispered in awe of his transformation. Lagos had seen its share of powerful men, but none who had walked away from power willingly. Yet Obinna did. He sold his mansions, shut down his private clubs, and dissolved his holding company. Each transaction stripped away another layer of the man he had been, the man who measured worth in wealth. The announcement came quietly, but rippled across the nation like a sermon. The Chiamaka Foundation for Women and Children. A sanctuary for the forgotten, a place where no one was too small to be seen, too poor to be heard. The city that once feared his name now wept at his new purpose. For the first time in years, Obinna's name stood not beside profit, but beside hope. His first public speech was nothing like the grand orations of his past. It was simple, raw, honest, a confession dressed in humility. Standing before hundreds gathered under a white canopy in the heart of Lagos, he looked into their eyes and said, "For too long, I built towers instead of bridges. I created walls instead of doors. But I have learned that we rise only when we lift others. This foundation isn't mine. It belongs to the people who taught me what love truly costs." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was reverent, soft, respectful, as though no one wanted to disturb the holiness of the moment. Reporters tried to frame it as a redemption campaign, a calculated image rebuild, but those who saw him closely knew better. There was no arrogance left in his eyes, only peace. Chiamaka recovered slowly, her strength returning in the rhythm of quiet days. When she first stepped into the foundation building, painted in bright white and gold, filled with children's laughter, she felt tears sting her eyes. The walls were covered with portraits of women who had once been invisible, now shining, now seen. And at the center of the courtyard, a bronze statue stood, a woman holding an umbrella in the rain, her face lifted toward the sky. Beneath it, engraved in marble, were the words, "Compassion is the only crown worth wearing." She turned to him that day, her voice soft but full of wonder. "You built this?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came not from pride, but from peace. "No," he said. "You did. I only paid attention." In the months that followed, Chiamaka became the foundation's heart, her humility the guiding light for everything they did. She taught the women sewing, literacy, and small trade skills. She sat among them, laughed with them, shared their meals on the floor. When people called her Madam Chiamaka, she smiled shyly and said, "Just call me sister." To her, leadership was not about standing above, but standing beside. Obinna, meanwhile, took to working quietly behind the scenes, signing papers, handling logistics, visiting hospitals and schools funded by the foundation. But he was no longer the man who issued orders. He was the man who listened. The man who had once been feared now spent his days in orphanage courtyards, letting children tug at his sleeves, their laughter echoing through the spaces his silence had once filled. One afternoon, during a press interview, a reporter asked him, "Sir, what changed you?" He looked at the woman with a calmness that came from truth, not performance, and said, "A smile. That's all. One smile that reminded me I was human." The foundation grew, spreading from Lagos to Enugu, from Abuja to Port Harcourt. Wherever there was poverty, they built hope. Wherever there was silence, they gave voice. And at the center of it all was the story that began with rain, roasted corn, and a smile that refused to bow to power. On their first anniversary, the entire team gathered in the foundation's central hall, volunteers, staff, and beneficiaries all celebrating the lives they had touched. After the speeches and laughter faded, Chiamaka walked quietly into Obinna's office. The room was simple now. No trophies, no gold frames, just one window overlooking the city, and a desk scattered with letters of gratitude. She set something down gently before him, a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. He looked at it curiously, unwrapping it slowly. Inside lay roasted corn, the same kind she once sold outside his building in the rain. He looked up at her, emotion flickering through his eyes. She smiled, that same disarming smile that had begun it all. "So you never forget," she said softly. "The girl who sold you your first smile." He held the roasted corn in his hand, the scent of smoke and memory rising between them. The empire he once built had vanished, but in that simple sacred moment, he realized something eternal had taken its place. He smiled back at her, eyes glistening, and said, "And the smile that built everything I have left." Outside, the laughter of children filled the air, echoing like a hymn, proof that love, once given freely, could rebuild an entire world. Some stories don't end with triumph or tragedy. They end with peace so powerful, It silences everything that came before it. Once, he was the man Lagos feared to speak to. Now he was the man Lagos prayed to meet. The billionaire who once bought silence with fear had been conquered by a girl whose laughter cost nothing but changed everything. Years later, their love was no longer gossip. It had become legend, told in markets, schools, and the quiet prayers of those who still believed that even the hardest hearts can heal. Time had not dulled their story. It had polished it into something sacred. The Chiamaka Foundation stood as living proof. Walls painted with joy, not ambition. Hallways filled with children's laughter instead of the echoes of power. Women who once slept in fear now woke to the promise of tomorrow. On its front gate, carved in bronze, were the words that had rewritten his life. Kindness conquers where strength cannot. Obinna Okafor, the man once untouchable, unreachable, unfeeling, had become a symbol of grace. His name no longer commanded fear. It invited faith. People spoke of him with quiet reverence, not for his wealth, but for the way he used it, to heal, to build, to redeem. He no longer wore suits of armor made from pride. He wore simplicity, humility, and the calm smile of a man who had finally forgiven himself. Their home stood far from the noise of the city. A modest villa surrounded by green fields and tall trees that swayed in the afternoon wind. It was not the mansion he once called home, but it was alive in a way those cold marble walls had never been. Children from the foundation often visited, chasing each other through the garden while Chiamaka tended to her flowers. She still hummed the same tune she once sang under his office awning in the rain, a melody that had haunted and healed him for years. From the porch, Obinna watched her move through the garden, her scarf dancing lightly in the breeze, her laughter bright as the day itself. He had known countless victories in his life, contracts won, empires built, enemies silenced, but none compared to the quiet victory of watching her simply live. The years had added wisdom to his face and silver to his hair, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes once feared across Nigeria, now carried only warmth. Sometimes, people asked him if he regretted giving up his empire, his wealth, his place among the powerful. His answer never changed. Power without peace is just another form of poverty. That afternoon, the air shimmered with sunlight, the kind that paints memories golden. He walked to her, slow but sure, the sound of the grass beneath his feet blending with her song. When she looked up, her smile was the same, timeless, unbroken, the one that had started it all. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, her voice soft. "The city, the meetings, the chaos." He chuckled quietly. "I thought I would," he said. "But now I wake up to laughter instead of alarms. I go to sleep beside peace instead of pride. No empire could give me that." She touched a flower petal gently, glancing at him. "You turned your power into kindness, Obinna. That's a greater empire than any you ever built." He smiled, looking out over the horizon where the sky burned gold. "You're the only empire I ever needed," he said, his tone quiet, steady, reverent, like a prayer spoken out loud. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind brushed through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of children playing in the distance. Chiamaka's eyes glistened with emotion, her hand finding his. There was no grandeur left in their love, no need for spectacle or proof, only presence, only truth. Theirs was a story that had been tested by storms, shaped by pain, and crowned not with luxury, but with grace. She leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "Then keep building it," she said. "Not with money, not with stone, but with the same heart that finally learned how to feel." He nodded, his eyes tracing the horizon, where the sun dipped low, casting light across everything they had fought to build. And as the evening light wrapped them in gold, Lagos whispered their story once more. Not of a billionaire's rise, not of a poor girl's defiance, but of a love so patient it rebuilt a broken man and redeemed a king. Her smile, that same unassuming, rain-born smile, glowed in the fading light, the eternal reminder that mercy, not might, is the truest power of all. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss another powerful tale like this one. Share this video with someone who still believes love can heal even the hardest hearts. And in the comments below, tell us, what does true redemption mean to you? Your voice might inspire the next story.